There are a number of faith development models of spiritual growth. The primary one that has been used, particularly in theology schools, is James Fowler's theory. And also, Maria Harris has an interesting theory. So those are the two predominant ones that I'll be having you work with this semester. However, I want to make sure that I share others as well, just to note that there are other ideas that people have had over time. The first individual I would look at is the um, mental health therapist Gordon Allport, who suggested that there were three phases as he discussed them. The first is what he called raw credulity. What a great name. I can think of that in terms of childhood and the whole idea of what they used to call the tabula rasa. In other words, people were born as a clean slate, and their experiences is what assist in developing who they become. But here he talks about children believing everything they hear about religion and spirituality that is shared by parents and authority figures. So that's how that's transmitted at that point in individuals' lives. Then he talks about what he calls satisfying rationalism. Here we're looking probably in the period of adolescence, which sometimes these days extend into the 20s very easily. And we even hear of people living at home in their 30s and 40s. However, I'm not sure that one would construe that as adolescence exactly. But basically, he talks about when individuals begin to question their beliefs and may even reject the parents' religion and spiritual values. This is a time when people react against things, and if people have been very controlling and with their children, this could be a time when a lot of negative experiences happen, both for the child and what they do in relationship to the family as well. And then he looks at what he calls religious maturity, where adults move between uncertainty and faith, but stay connected with religious and spiritual traditions. Again, approach religion and spiritual traditions critically, but feel liberated instead of oppressed by rules and guidelines that a lot of religions entail. The next slide will be kind of an overview of the stages of faith that Fowler discusses and what we will look at here. He begins with 0 being primal, which is probably the pre-birth experience. And then he looks at intuitive, projective, mythic, literal, synthetic, conventional, individuative, reflective, conjunctive, and universalizing. These are all terms that Fowler had constructed to describe various stages that one goes through in life, all of which some people do not attain. And also, this method is pretty much a linear method. As you'll notice, there's 6 stages of faith versus a more circular model that we might look at. And then Harris's model, we'll talk about later, is a little different. But basically, Fowler represents more of a European American perspective on spirituality, which may, in a lot of ways, miss a number of diverse cultural experiences that people may have. So as you look at these stages of faith, think in your own growth, which ones seem to resonate more with you. You may agree or disagree with Fowler or some of his, or even with Harris, or at some point you may end up integrating the various stages that have been presented into your own experience and understanding, where you may have had some stages from one theory and some stages from another based on your own unique life experience. So faith development, what we're looking at here are stages that represent levels of cognitive complexity achieved rather than age-determined tasks. So one can be in one of the stages for many years before transitioning to the next, so it's not so much bound by age per se. Fowler defined faith as the pattern of our relatedness to self, others, and our world in light of our relatedness to ultimacy. And you'll notice I've taken that from Canda's book, but Fowler has a rather lengthy book as well of around 200 pages that I've condensed this information from. If you have a particular interest in this area, you may read the book if that would be of help to you. But instead of going into any further detail with the contents of the book, I want to mostly look at distilling the stages of faith that he discusses. The first of which is what he calls intuitive projective. Generally, this is from ages 2 to 7. However, some people may go into their teens or later in this stage. And he describes this as the pre-operational brain focus on one dimension or feature of a situation at a time, which leads to erroneous or partial interpretation. So we're looking at just one dimension or feature at a time. And this is an underdeveloped understanding of causal and temporal relationships, resulting in the child's construction of experience as an episodic sort of progression. In other words, life happens in episodes that the person remembers throughout their childhood, for instance. And here the capacity for taking on the role or perspective of others is severely limited. So basically the child is pretty much constrained to looking at their own role and their own experience of what's going on around them, as opposed to trying to understand other people's feelings or ways of looking at things. And again, here authority is attached to parent-like adults, again based on physical size and power, or external symbols such as uniforms or command over large vehicles or machines. Also, the visible consequence of one's actions are a focus at this point in life, and the results in terms of punishment or praise constitute what is right or wrong. So punishment and praise are a large theme of this period of faith development, as Fowler describes it. Symbols or images tend to function as identical with or as part of what they represent. And here faith is fantasy-filled and imaginative and can be powerfully and permanently influenced by examples, models, actions, and stories of significant adults and forces in the child's life. So, if the child is having a lot of stress in their environment, that's certainly going to be of great impact in their life space or life path. The next stage that Fowler talks about or describes is what he calls the mythic literal stage, generally ages 6 or 7 to around ages 11 or 12, but again, someone could be in this phase for a much longer period of time, depending on their life space. But again, he describes this stage as not necessarily tied to a chronicle age or biological maturation, as I mentioned. The child can mentally review a sequence of observed actions and deduce causal relationships. Here one might consider this as part of the concrete operations of another theorist in terms of cognitive development. Here, new understandings of time, causality, and the conformity of action to a certain natural lawfulness is experienced by the growing child. The major gain in role-taking ability happens during this time, where the child role or observing the parent role is something that's clearer. Again, choices are made and preferences are expressed and relied upon, but the criteria by which these are made are not yet matters of conscious reflection. So the child isn't reflecting on their preferences. They're operating mostly from a feeling level, you might say. Identifications are strong with those like us, while the images of those who are different can be harshly stereotyped. Again, this might be from fear or lack of experience. And moral judgment has a new element of reciprocity and a new conception of fairness. In other words, in this stage, you're looking at you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours kind of thinking. Symbols must refer to something specific and will have an imaginative analogy with some element of concrete experience. Here, the most favored images or symbols of God are anthropomorphic. In other words, they see God in human form. For instance, the old man on the chair ruling out um, one's destiny when they cross over at the time of death might be an example of what one might think of God looking like, if one believes in God at all, and may view the wine in Christian communion as the actual blood of Christ. So that is the sort of thing that would be examples that would fit within this mythic literal stage. The next stage that Fowler describes, stage 3, is what he calls synthetic conventional. Again, looking from adolescence through adulthood. And some people may make mostly through their adult life, maybe in this stage. Not everybody progresses beyond necessarily. But again, it's the ability here to compartmentalize. In other words, when with peers I act as they expect, and when with parents I can comply with their wishes, would be an example. Or here a hierarchy of authorities are created. Peers and their values become more important, with other authorities being subordinated to them. So in other words, at this point in life, the peers become more important in terms of what their values are than one's parents. And again, the capacity for abstract thinking and manipulation of concepts, which strongly affects the process by which a person forms their own identity. Again, the person has an ideology or outlook, but has not objectified it for systematic reflection and is largely unaware of it. So there's kind of an ideology that hasn't been questioned, one might say. Here, symbols are not perceived as literal as they are in stage 2 and can evoke deep meaning and loyalty, but are not seen as separate from what they symbolize. And in stage 4 also, persons no longer are defined by the composite of his or her roles and meanings to others. And here one begins to construct an individualized self-identity and outlook or ideology formed from the previously held conventional faith. So in other words, building on what one learned as a child or memorized or whatever about reality. And then there's some unavoidable tensions that he points out here in this adolescent, early adult period, because it is a really rite of passage kind of between childhood and adulthood. Here, individuality versus being defined by one's group or group membership becomes a focus. And subjectivity in one's strongly felt but unexamined feelings versus objectivity and critical reflection become challenges. So, do I become defined as the group, which would be kind of an exterior locus of control, or do I grasp and embrace my own individuality and make decisions based on how I view things, which would be more of a internal locus of control, as an example. Again, self-fulfillment versus self-actualization. And self-actualization versus service to and being for others. So again, it's the individual versus the community or the group, tensions that go back and forth, being of service or trying to develop one's own self sense. A commitment to the relative versus struggle with the possibility of an absolute. Again, looking at fine shades, gray perhaps, versus the black and white kinds of rules that one might have had in earlier life. And again, previously held creeds, symbols, and stories are demythologized through critical analysis. This is maybe a time when someone would not any longer believe in Santa Claus, although that may have come earlier for some, or other mythical figures that people believe in either all of their life or at least at some point. And in this process represents an upheaval in one's life at any point and can last 5 to 7 years or longer. And some people have a real struggle with the whole issues of adolescence, and this could go into adulthood, particularly in terms of one's faith approach. Stage 5 is the next stage that Fowler looks at and talks about it being from 1 to 6 years in adolescence or forward, and sometimes beyond the age of 31. Here, most people do not reach stage 5, and only about 1 in every 6 interviewees of people that Fowler talked with over age 31 fit the categories that this stage describes. So at this point or juncture, many people do not go beyond stage 4, for instance. As he says, 1 in 6 appear to go beyond into stage 5. And basically the person here views the cross displayed during religious services as a symbol of the crucifixion of Christ, for instance, if one is Christian, and a representative of sacrifice, death, or rebirth. It's a representation, in other words, more symbolic. Polarities in life are no longer seen as problems to be solved, but realities to be accepted. And either or debates become both and resolutions. And then the person strives to unify opposites in mind and in experience. This is very frustrating to people under stage 5 who like to have very clear boundaries about their understandings of reality and what some people may construe as right and wrong, however that is discussed or displayed. Also, determinism and free will may be considered to play a role in life. Again, these are sometimes theological debates that go on in various religions as well, whether one is predetermined to behave in a certain way and have a certain life path, or whether one has free will to choose. And God may be experienced as both personal and abstract. Here, humanity may be understood to be both good and evil. There's an understanding that there's both and. Again, one's faith is of supreme value, and that commitments based on faith must be carried out regardless of the consequences. So this might be an example of someone whose faith requires them to behave in a certain way that may not be in compliance with legal definitions of how one might behave. Again, individual constructs an image of the self as seen by others, and simultaneously takes account of the fact that other persons are performing the same operations in their relationships. Operative awareness of mutual role-taking results in a kind of third-person perspective on relationships with people, events, and objects, or with what we call the world. And the conformist stage has to do with one's being tuned into others' judgment. This leads to the last phase of Fowler's developmental faith paths for individuals. He calls this stage universalizing, and the person at this stage becomes a disciplined activist embodied of the imperatives of absolute love and justice, of which stage 5 persons have partial comprehension. Persons at stage 6 live sacrificial lives amid the transformation of humankind. They're kind of like Kuan Yin, the Buddhist bodhisattva, who is what I consider the cosmic social worker, who is here to transform the pain and suffering of the world as the Buddhists describe her. But again, Fowler talks about these are universalizers, which she would be an example, and who are often experienced as subversive of the structures, including religious structures of society, by which we sustain our individual and corporate survival, security, and significance. Few are ever considered to be at this stage of faith development. And Fowler gives examples of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Dag Hammarskjöld, who was Secretary General of the United Nations, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran theologian who was murdered by the Nazis following a plot on Hitler's life, Thomas Merton, who was um, a mystic and theologian, Mother Teresa of Calcutta, Bishop Desmond Tutu. Again, I believe I mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. One person I found particularly in the 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s, although he died in the 90s, was Dom Helder Camara, the Archbishop of Recife in Brazil. One of my favorite quotes of all time comes from Camara, which I place here. Um, the picture above talks about his involvement in nonviolence against nuclear weapons. That certainly is an anti-establishment sort of stance to take based on his understanding of the gospel. But the one I think is most important, and I think telling for our country and the current angst we're in as far as how we're demonizing the poor, Bishop Kamara says, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." That's really a heavy thought in terms of our current stance today in the world and the situation of poor people, where food programs in the last year have been cut by the Congress to children who go to bed hungry at night. One has to ask, what kind of a country does this sort of thing? Moving on to Washburn stages of faith. Washburn certainly isn't one of the leading people that is referred to a lot, but I think his or his or her stages of faith are of importance in terms of our own reflection here. Again, three stages like Allport, what he calls pre-egoic, again referencing to the ego, sounds somewhat Freudian, I would say. He talks about pre-Oedipal period in childhood, not advanced enough for cognitive development, so that's the very beginning stages of life. Then he talks about the egoic stage. Here, roles and values shape one's personality. Emptiness and alienation offer stimulus towards transcendence, towards the higher self, or some self, one might say. And then what he calls trans-egoic, where one integrates and begins this stage in midlife. He thinks this is the time in which there's a spiritual awakening that happens. Certainly this is an arguable theory in that most, in terms of adolescence, seems to be a stage where people begin to question, and this whole part of the path involves some element of awakening. Then we move to Maria Harris, who's the second major theoretician I'm hoping we will focus on and reflect on this semester in our work. And I think her work, as well as Fowler, certainly applies to our work with clients. Her book that describes her method is called Dance of the Spirit, The 7 Steps of Women's Spirituality. However, this particular theory applies to all genders. And you'll note on week, I believe this is week 2 or 3, I guess it's week 2, I've uploaded an article I've published on domestic violence survivors, in which I've used Maria Harris's stages. I've discussed them briefly in the article, and I believe this applies to a number of different client populations that you might work with. But basically we'll overview what she's talked about here. She describes this spirituality as a rhythmic series of movements, unlike the steps of a ladder or staircase, that do not go up and down, often precipitated by a life crisis such as divorce or realization of a sense of personal identity. Women or persons who fit within this category, the spiritual lives are much like those in a dance, where there's a movement backward and forward, turning and returning, bending and bowing, circling and spiraling. There's no need to finish the dance except in a woman's own good time and God's. So step 1, Maria talks about awakening. This is the triggering event, a crisis of some sort, like divorce, death, or shift in one's life direction, or realization of a sense of personal identity and awareness of the presence of the self begins to emerge for the person, leading then to step 2, which is the discovering step. Here is a way that one begins to look around and see or notice what is there in one's own spirituality. Here the person lays aside traditional teachings and discovers new images of the divinity which take on life and meaning, which are uniquely present in one's own life. Here, discovering is a theology of revelation, and women accordingly take what they find and generally mold the findings into a shape fitting for them as spiritual creatures in their world and reality. Now, Maria Harris again represents a Christian point of view. She was a Catholic nun who left and married a Christian brother, actually, and I was in religious education back in the 70s and 80s, and Maria Harris was a major figure in the religious education literature in the Catholic Church at that time. But again, that helps situate why she would talk about particular religious elements in her dance, which can be applied whether you're an atheist, a Christian, or any other religious focus. It can be applied. Step 3 is the creating phase, where one involves it's a similar process to what Langer's 1982 artistic model described, contemplating the material of one's life, engaging in interacting with it, reforming it into a new whole, and finally allowing this stuff to emerge and release into the world. Now, since we're talking about dance of the spirit, some people progress forward and return back to an earlier stage and then work further and move to the next stage. So stage 3 may be a person who would begin to enter the stage and then go back into stage 2, which is the discovery stage still, to do more work in order to move forward into the creating element. And then the creating step leads to what she calls the dwelling. Step 4 would be dwelling, where one, after developing this stuff that emerges and releases to the world, this idea of turning out of the outer world and turning to the inner presence, to one's inner life, abandoning characteristic occurs after spirituality has taken shape and becomes formed and created. So this becomes inner work that the individual does at this point in the dance. Step 5 looks at what she calls nourishing. Here, one integrates the previous elements and feeds the spirit. Nourishing activities are calisthenics for the soul, as she says, such as prayer, contemplation, meditation, journal writing, fasting, things that enrich one's own inner spiritual life. And again, spirituality is more of a generic term as I'm construing it here, which means that one can be an atheist and work on this spiritual nourishing as she talks about it, because it's about massaging and growing and telling this whole meaning and purpose element in our lives, which is essentially what spirituality is about. In step 7, Harris calls this transforming. Here, women or those in this particular path are impelled to go beyond themselves and their families to a spirituality that cares for the universe. Again, a woman's spirituality culminates in becoming a steward of the cosmos, similar to the descriptions of the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin that I talked about earlier. When this step is reached, women can stop for a while and realize they've reached the time to begin the dance once more at a more fundamental level. And this is almost what we saw in Fowler's universalizing stage, because essentially she's describing some of those elements, such as reaching out and caring for the universe. And at times that is somewhat of a sacrificial, denying oneself to help others kind of direction. But again, in this model, she talks about women, but men and people who are marginalized may also fit into these descriptions. So while you see the word women, it applies to all humans. Fritz Ozier developed a set of stages as well. He has 4 stages, And again, this looks to be more of another Christian point of view. There don't seem to be much in the way of non-Christian faith development models, although if anyone knows of any, I certainly would entertain looking at them. I haven't found them. Stage one, he says, God is responsible for everything in the individual's understanding of reality. And in stage two, God becomes powerful but can be influenced through prayer, vows, rituals, and good deeds. So here one can plead with God to change whatever the course might be of one's experience. Stage three is where God does not control individual and secular concerns. So in other words, not blaming God for someone dying of a particular disease and not healing them might be an example of someone who may be in one of the earlier stages that would do that. Stage four, God is present in the world and active in concert with human will. Again, that sort of includes the other three stages, but having a different perspective on how one's understanding of what God might be would work, again, from a Christian point of view. And then stage five, God informs every moment and commitment in one's life. So this is a different way of looking at faith development, but again within the context of Christianity. So if you have Christian clients, there may be some of these elements that fit when you're working with individuals. And then the last one I want to talk about and share with you is Vicky Jania's approach, which again is a 5-stage approach. Stage one is the egocentric faith, where one operates out of fear and comfort. In other words, punishment and, affirmation, as we looked at a couple of the other theories. Stage two would be the dogmatic faith. In other words, doing what one must do to earn God's love and approval, following all the rules that we're taught. Stage three would be transitional. This would be more in the adolescence phase of life. Again, it's that searching stage where one questions what one's been taught and searches for further connections and meaning. Stage four is the reconstructed faith. This is where one moves from that searching to having some assertion about what the meaning and purpose of one's life is, and this will fulfill one's spiritual need and nourish one as well. And then 5 would be this transcendent faith, this understanding that there's more than myself in terms of the universe and what's supporting and in the environment. And this could have a deity attached to it, and it may or may not. But that would be kind of a rounding out of the various faith development theories. As you complete your assignments this semester, the faith development is important to keep in mind because it may or may not impact your work with your clients. I'm thinking that it may at times be beneficial to have this perspective as well as the other kinds of developmental theories that you've learned. In the module this week, I've listed some tables with the stages of faith, and Wilbur's model is in that in table 2 at the first table and then the last table. Wilbur's model is somewhat complex and convoluted, so I didn't want to take time at this point to go into it. However, if you're interested in looking at that, I encourage you to do further research. And then you'll also find on week 2 a book review that I did on the social teachings of the Catholic Church by a professor at St. Louis University. Interestingly, he looked at faith and justice associated with students that he takes abroad to study other cultures. And I responded to some of the issues that might have been beneficial with that. But again, it's kind of an idea of people that you might meet in terms of, it has some understandings that you might utilize if you are so inclined to read the article. That's kind of rounding out the material for this week as kind of a quick overview. I hope this is helpful in working with the other materials that you encountered this week in your studies.